Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. Welcome to the Erickson Report. I'm your host, Larry Erickson. And for the next almost half hour, we're going to be talking about a few topics that I think deserve your attention, which hopefully will be of some interest to you. If you have any reactions to the show, they are always welcome. You can send them to me at my personal email, which is whoviating, whoviating, whoviating@aol.com. And by the way, if you want to get your name mentioned on air, be the first person to know where that email comes from. Any event, with that out of the way, let's get to this. Last time I spent some time talking about the recent attacks on the right to an abortion. I want to follow up on that by noting that the news is not all bad. For one thing, you know those so-called heartbeat bills, the ones that ban abortions once a so-called fetal heartbeat can be detected, which is usually at about 6 weeks of gestation and more, before a lot of women even know they're pregnant. Before I get too far off this, I wanted to include this here. The reason I call it a so-called fetal heartbeat is because in this context, the term fetal heartbeat is bogus. It's a PR ploy. It doesn't mean anything. What's actually being detected medically is cardiac activity, which is more specifically, it's some pulsing among some cells indicating communication among a group of cells that will eventually become cardiac cells. There is no cardiovascular system at this point of gestation, which means this can't be called a heartbeat by any rational definition of the term. Anyway, getting back to what I was saying, 4 states this year have passed these mislabeled bills, but they've also failed in several more this year, including in some Republican-held ones. Efforts in Texas, Florida, South Carolina, Tennessee, and West Virginia all fell short. Just as importantly, there is a form of pushback going on in that some places are taking steps to protect the right to an abortion in the unhappy but unfortunately not unlikely event that Roe v. Wade is overturned. For example, the Guttmacher Institute reported that 2018 was the first time in recent years when the number of proactive policies that were enacted outpaced new restrictions. 29 states and the District of Columbia passed 80 measures to expand access to reproductive health care in 2018. This year, a variety of states are expanding access to abortion services by repealing restrictions, updating their codes, doing away with old measures that really aren't even enforced anymore. Early this year, New York enacted a law to enshrine the protections of Roe into state law and removed abortion from the state's penal code. Vermont lawmakers actually enacted a state constitutional amendment protecting the right of abortion. In Maine, a bill is moving through the legislature requiring the state Medicaid program and private insurance companies to cover abortion care. Nevada has removed criminal penalties for people who terminate a pregnancy without consulting a physician. Illinois has removed old measures requiring spousal consent and waiting periods, as well as eliminating criminal penalties for doctors who perform abortions. And on top of that, the state of Illinois now legally recognizes abortion care as health care. And in Kansas of all places, at the end of April, the state Supreme Court ruled by 6-1 that the Kansas state constitution enshrines the right of a woman to get an abortion in the state. More generally, it also turns out that new Alabama law is not particularly popular there. According to a poll done last year but only released in May, only 31% of Alabama voters actually support a measure as strict as the one that was passed. And it's not just Alabama. According to a new USA Today Ipsos poll, by 55 to 45, Americans oppose these so-called fetal heartbeat bills. By nearly 3-1, 73-27, they oppose the idea of seeing all abortion facilities in their state close. 50% say the Supreme Court should uphold Roe v. Wade. Another 30% say that Roe should be upheld, but maybe with some additional restrictions. Only 20% say it should be overturned. And finally, for now on this, in Georgia, at least 5 county district attorneys have said that they will not enforce the new anti-choice law. On the other hand, there are 2 things I want you to keep in mind right now. There was an Indiana law that barred abortion based on the fetus's sex, race, or disability. The Second Circuit Court of Appeals threw out that law as unconstitutional, and recently the Supreme Court refused to hear an appeal from that decision. But as part of that, Clarence Thomas took the opportunity to launch a vicious and wholly irrelevant attack on birth control pioneer Margaret Sanger. I told you, if they succeed in killing Roe v. Wade, they're going to come for birth control next. The other thing, and never, ever forget this, Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, Georgia, Alabama, Ohio, Missouri, and Kentucky, all sporting their brand new anti-choice, anti-women's health laws, all of them rank among the 10 worst states for maternal mortality, infant mortality, or both. The connection between lack of access to abortion care and lack of access to pre- and postnatal health care is very, very real. All right, moving on from there to a revamped version of some features of our old show, dressed up and redefined as 2 weeks of stupid, clowns and outrages. We're going to do this chronologically, so we're going to start on May 11th with a very clownish thing. There was a poll done by Civic Science released on that day. They are a Pittsburgh-based market research firm, and they had surveyed 3,600 Americans about mathematics instruction in schools. 56 response to one of the questions, 56% of the respondents said Arabic numerals should not be taught in American schools. 29% said they should be part of the curriculum. 15% had no opinion or were unsure. And if you don't get why that is being labeled as clown here, you don't get why that is some combination of ignorance and bigotry, these are Arabic numerals. Oh, and by the way, before you start going, oh, those stupid right-wingers again, know that when respondents are separated into 3 categories, Gopper, Democrat, and Independent, not one of those 3 groups showed a majority in favor of using these numbers in public schools. Now, here's one of those cases, next up, where you can't say if it's a clown or an outrage, so I'll leave it for you to decide. On May 16th, on Fox and Friends, Andrew Napolitano, who was Fox News' senior judicial analyst, said that tossing out Roe was actually no big deal because if you want an abortion, you just go to New Jersey or New York where, quote, infanticide is legal, unquote. May 17th brings another clown, Missouri State Representative and former cop Barry Hovis, who said, referring to his time as a cop, that most of the rape cases he dealt with were not, quoting now, the gentleman jumping out of the bushes that nobody had ever met. That was just 1 or 2 times out of 100. Most of them were date rapes or consensual rapes. Later that day, Hovis said that he meant to say date rapes or consensual or rape, which actually in context makes no more sense than the original statement did. The reporter who covered the story noted that Hovis did not correct himself at the time, despite a witness saying that a lot of watts were ringing around the chamber when he said that. May 20th brought us an outrage when NPR reported on a 40-year-old California law that requires public school teachers on extended sick leave to pay for their own substitute teachers, an amount that could easily mean half their paycheck. The law is finally getting some overdue attention, and of course there are those who say that changing this law is a bad idea because, of course, it only makes sense that the costs of a substitute can't be borne by the budget of the entire school district, but must be dumped entirely on the back of a single sick individual. May 21st, this was the clown that you know. During a hearing before the House Financial Services Committee, HUD Secretary and man perpetually in REM sleep, Ben Carson, couldn't describe basic terms related to the agency. For one, he thought that REO, which is REO and it stands for real estate owned, which is what happens when a property goes into foreclosure, he thought it referred to Oreos, the cookie. Now, you've heard about that. But why it's here is that he didn't even have the self-awareness to be embarrassed or ashamed about his cluelessness about the agency he heads. After the hearing, he tweeted that he planned to send a member of the committee a box of Oreos. Ben Carson is a quintessential clown. I mean, he's not stupid. He was, after all, a world-renowned brain surgeon. He's not stupid. But it's clear that what he is incredibly lazy, and he just doesn't give a damn. May 22nd and May 24th brought more outrages as the Tweety Pie administration, and by the way, I call him Tweety Pie because of his love of tweets, just seemed appropriate. I used to call him the rump because he's so obviously an ass, but this just seemed more fitting. Anyway, the Tweety Pie administration continues its attack on transgender rights. On May 22nd, HUD announced that it intends to reverse the requirement that operators of homeless shelters that receive federal funding have to, quoting, provide equal access in accordance with an individual's gender identity. The change would allow shelters to segregate transgender people and to consider a person's biology when determining if they'll be admitted to the shelter in the first place. On May 24th, Health and Human Services published a proposal to remove a section of the Affordable Care Act that defined discrimination on the basis of sex to include gender identity. This change, if it goes through, would make it acceptable for healthcare providers to refuse to treat transgender people and for insurance companies to refuse to cover them. May 24th brings another case of, is this clown or is this outrage? You know, I report, you decide. Alabama is amending its marriage laws to let bigots off the hook. Under existing state law, couples are required to obtain a marriage license from a probate judge and hold a ceremony to solemnize the union. Under the proposed law, the solemnization requirement is eliminated and the responsibility is on the couples themselves to record their own marriage. Probate judges would simply pass those records along to a state office. In other words, this is all being done so that bigot judges can say they have no part in issuing marriage licenses to same-sex couples, and bigot ministers can refuse to do a ceremony. This next one, however, is definitely an outrage. Not the action, the reason for it. Under the heading of We Are Not Alone, on May 25th, Felix Klein, Germany's Commissioner on Anti-Semitism, warned German Jews that in the face of last year's 20% rise in anti-Semitic crimes in Germany, it could be dangerous for Jews to wear kippahs, that is the traditional skull cap that is also known as a yarmulke. It would be dangerous for Jews to wear kippahs in public. He had already warned Jews against wearing kippahs when visiting big cities. May 26th, in a remarkable but classically clown case of lack of self-awareness, White House Principal Deputy Press Secretary named as Hogan Gidley claimed Democrats received compliant and complicit treatment from the news media in a slant that makes everything negative no matter how positive the subject may be. Now, next, I pretty much exempt Tweety Pie from clown notices because he's such an easy target that it seems unfair to others, but I couldn't resist this one. On May 28th, during his trip to Japan, Tweety Pie claimed that he did Joe Biden a favor by calling him a low IQ individual because Kim Jong-un had previously called him a low IQ idiot. In that spirit, I promise that the next time someone calls Tweety Pie an imbecile, I'll do him a favor by saying he's only a moron. And the clowns keep coming. On May 29th, after Robert Mueller's presser, right-wing blowhard and professional nitwit Sebastian Gorka, said Mueller wasn't qualified to park a car. Well, this is Sebastian Gorka parking in 2017. This is Sebastian Gorka parking in 2019. By the way, he got a ticket for an expired meter for that one. All right, from clown to outrage, and this is a real one. The EU, the European Union, and EU member states had donated 2 classrooms to be used in the West Bank for Palestinian children in grades 1 to 6. In October, the Israeli civil administration in charge of policy in the occupied territories seized and dismantled the classrooms. The EU missions in the West Bank called for the immediate reconstruction of the classrooms. Israel not only ignored that call, on May 31st, it emerged that it can only be considered a deliberately cruel move. Israel is auctioning off the stolen classrooms, not only hindering the ability of Palestinian children to get an education, but actually looking to profit off doing it. The auction is expected to be held in the next week or so. But don't forget the BDS movement is anti-Semitic. Just ask Israel. May 31st brought us the mass murder in Virginia Beach. The best summation of the meaning of this event was delivered quite unintentionally by CNN, which opened its report by saying, and I'm quoting, "At least 12 people were killed Friday after a gunman opened fire at a municipal building in Virginia Beach. The attack was the deadliest mass shooting in the U.S. since November." I'll just leave you with this. It's an oft-reprised headline from The Onion. "No way to prevent this, says only nation where this regularly happens." And finally, we have one more outrage. On June 1st, Rhode Island Bishop Thomas Tobin tweeted that Catholics must not support or attend any LGBTQ Pride Month's commemorations in June, warning that such events promote a culture and activities that are especially harmful for children. This from the bishop of a church with a long and demonstrated history of child sexual abuse that was actively covered up by the church hierarchy, including in a diocese in Pennsylvania where Tobin served as an auxiliary bishop. By the way, Pride Month is particularly significant this year, since this year marks the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots. And if you don't know what those were, look them up. And we're going to take a break. And we are back. Now we move on to what I hope will be a regular feature of this show. It's called A Longer Look, and it's where we examine a topic in somewhat more depth than we would normally have time for. This time, the topic is immigration. We have been exposed to, have suffered through, been heartbroken by the string of stories extending over the past few years of the cruelty, the bigotry, the casual indifference to the welfare of human beings that comprise the immigration policies of the Tweety Pie administration. We have seen the families torn apart. We have seen the children in cages. We've seen the dismantling of lives of people who have been here in the U.S. for some cases for decades, who have roots here, lives here, families here. Some who came as children young enough such that the U.S. is the only home they have ever known. We have seen increasingly furious attempts to deny the legal rights of asylum seekers. All these people denied, degraded, dismissed because they are illegal. More truly and exactly because they are other. They are the not us. Which should be actually no surprise, since that's the way it's pretty much always been done. The very first U.S. law touching on immigration was the Naturalization Act of 1790. That limited naturalization, that is the process by which an immigrant can become a citizen, limited naturalization to free white persons of good character, thus by definition excluding Native Americans, indentured servants, slaves, free blacks, and later Asians. Starting in the 1850s, tens of thousands of Chinese laborers have been welcomed in the American West. They were a source of cheap labor, particularly to build the railroads. When the demand for Chinese labor dried up, a racist anti-Chinese backlash quickly followed. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which barred the entry of Chinese laborers for 10 years and declared that Chinese could not become citizens. The act was renewed in 1892 for another 10 years, and in 1902, Chinese immigration was made permanently illegal until the law was changed some decades later. Chinese remained ineligible for citizenship until 1943. American experience with Chinese exclusion spurred later movements for immigration restrictions against other undesirable groups, such as Middle Easterners, Hindus and East Indians, and the Japanese, as more recently, Muslims and people from, in the words of Tweety Pie, shithole countries. For example, the Immigration Act of 1924 barred immigration from Asia and set quotas on the number of immigrants from the Eastern Hemisphere, that is, Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. The quotas for specific countries were based on 2% of the U.S. population from that country in the 1890 census. So populations poorly represented in 1890 were heavily restricted in their ability to immigrate, which specifically affected Poles and other Slavs, Jews, Italians, and Greeks. The latter two groups also affected by the notion dating from the 1890s that Mediterranean people were inferior to northern, that is, whiter Europeans. The purpose of the bill? According to the U.S. Department of State Office of the Historian, the purpose of the bill was, quote, to preserve the ideal of U.S. homogeneity, unquote. Or as a writer at the website openborders.info noted, white supremacy has always been a central feature of U.S. immigration policy. Now, there were some advances in the 60s and 70s, such as the 1968 Act that eliminated immigration discrimination based on race, place of birth, sex, or residence, along with abolishing restrictions on immigration from Asia. A 1976 law eliminated preferential treatment for immigrants of the Western Hemisphere, and a 1986 law included provisions through which over 2.6 million previously undocumented immigrants were able to obtain legal status. So let's be clear. Let's be clear about this. While what we have seen these past couple of years may be something of a change from the few decades preceding it, it's not a real change, it's merely a reversion to the way we had always done things. It has always been about preserving our homogeneity in the face of the other, the not us. By the way, know full well that in talking about the past couple of years, I am not letting Barack Obama, the amazing Mr. O, off the hook. He deported more people than any previous president. But I also have to acknowledge that in the latter years of his presidency, it really does appear that the efforts were focused on deporting people with actual criminal records, not just anyone they happened to come across or anyone that they were able to find. But amidst all the news surrounding us on this, I recall one case from 2 years ago that encapsulated to me everything wrong with our national policies on immigration. His name is Andres Magana Ortiz, and he was an undocumented immigrant who had lived in the U.S. for nearly 30 years. He has an American wife and 3 U.S.-born children. During his time here, he worked his way from migrant coffee farmer to owning his own land and being prominent in Hawaii's coffee industry, even to helping the U.S. Department of Agriculture conduct a 5-year study into a destructive insect species that was damaging coffee crops and helping to run 15 other small farms. He lost his fight not to be deported, despite letters of support from Hawaii's entire congressional delegation and the judge in his case, who, while legally unable to stop Ortiz's deportation, wrote a scathing opinion saying that, quote, the government decision shows that even the good hombres are not safe. That last part a reference to Tweety Pie's claim that immigration was only going after the bad hombres. On July 7, 2017, Ortiz voluntarily left for Mexico just days before he was to be deported. So here's the question that still haunts me. What was the point of this? What was gained by making him leave? What had been lost by allowing him to stay? What was accomplished by this, beyond satisfying the white supremacist desires of the bigoted xenophobes occupying the upper reaches of the Tweety Pie administration? Just how sick are our national policies? And consider this. Ignore for the moment that by the usual way such stories were told to us as we were growing up, Ortiz is a classical, almost cliche American success story, rising from migrant laborer to landowner, business person, upstanding figure in the community. Ignore all that for the moment, just focus on the fact that he had been here for nearly 30 years and it didn't matter. Because there's no sort of statute of limitations on being an undocumented immigrant. No matter how long you've been here, no matter how many and thick are the roots that you have set down, no matter how stable your life is established, no matter how much you may have contributed to your community, it doesn't matter. Think about that. There's no statute of limitations. Except for murder, terrorism, and sexual crimes against children, federal law has statute of limitations for all sorts of crimes and all sorts of offenses. We have federal statutes of limitations for kidnapping, for fraud, racketeering, embezzlement, all sorts of serious crimes, but not for being an undocumented immigrant, not for crossing a border without the required official permission. You did it 2 years ago, 10 years ago, 30 years, 50 years, it makes no difference. This is insane. Even the notoriously anti-immigration, and note I do not say anti-undocumented immigration, I say anti-immigration. The anti-immigration Mark Krikorian, even he a few years ago allowed us how, even as he disagreed with it as a matter of policy, at least he said it makes a certain kind of sense to say that an undocumented immigrant who has been in the U.S. for 3 years, which is his time frame, and has set down roots here, should not be deported. Even he was prepared to say that, even though he disagreed with the idea, yeah, it was an arguable point. So yes, as a first small step to bringing sanity to our policies, there should be a time limit. There should be some sort of a statute of limitations. There should be some point beyond which being able to show roots in the community and an established life will free you from the daily fear of discovery and deportation, the daily fear of ripping up your life and the ripping apart of your family. Another small step is realizing that our borders have always been porous, that those who rant about regaining control of our borders ignore the fact that we've never had that much control over them in the first place. I want to talk more about this next time, more about how we have often found it necessary to recognize that there's a real limit to what we can do and accept the facts on the ground, as we did to some extent in that 1986 law I mentioned. There is one more very dramatic, very radical step we could take, which again I intend to address next time. A step pretty much everyone on all points of this topic insists that they are against, but which deserves a hearing because there is a case to be made, and I won't say a really persuasive one because I'm not really persuaded by it myself entirely, but there is a case to be made for open borders. But whatever the merits of that, we need to realize that we have now is a thoroughly broken system enforced by the well-named ICE because it is cold-hearted to its core, now directed by an administration chock full of bigoted xenophobes who don't care who they deport as long as they can eject and reject foreigners, them, the other. This must not be allowed to go on. That's it. We're done. We're just about out of time. We're just about out of here. We will see you next time. In the meantime, you have the best couple of weeks you possibly can. And as always, peace.